The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
So how does a writer like Butler sort of hit upon this subject? I mean, is this, Butler was, he was a generation younger than Darwin, but, not that much younger. He had met Darwin. Darwin, after this book was published, Darwin invited him to his house because he was very interested. He wanted to explore this, what's going on in this guy's mind, because there were lots of things going on here that, Darwin found rather fascinating. So why would Darwin even care about a book like this? What's in this book that might interest, a great scientist like Charles Darwin? I'm not saying that Butler and Darwin got along, but Darwin invited him down to his house for a weekend to talk with him. So what's here? Yeah, Charles.
Well, kind of, in a way, the professor did for machines what Darwin did for living things, in terms of how, machines can, they all have their own varieties. There's variation, and then there's also gradual increments, how they just get better and better, and then obviously if they don't get better, they just get discarded. And so it's kind of like evolution for machines.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really
we certainly all admit, don't we, that machines are constantly being improved upon. And the first versions are rarely, the ones that are the contemporary ones. Yeah.
I think up until this point, obviously we've been controlling that progression.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, machines get to a point where they're almost evolving naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't.
Yeah. No, this is we're not going to grant this crazy professor his points here, but we want to sort of use these to sort of think about some of these questions. And we're going to read some further works, but somehow, how does this whole subject of machines come into this book? Why are the Erewhonians care one way or another about machines? And in fact, as the story goes, they all rose up against machines and destroyed the machines, because they were concerned that the machines were evolving into something that was going to be, they were going to compete. So this sort of came in. So the Erewhonians, what's their take? How did this all become so urgent for them? Will that make any sense? Why machines would bother Erewhonians?
I'm not really sure.
Not sure. Okay. The Erewhonians are very concerned about, being as fit as they possibly can. How do machines influence in this book? How does this book see machines as influencing fitness? There's some kind of, yeah.
The more you have to rely on machines, the less you have to rely on your own abilities.
Yeah, machines sort of, as we were saying last class, they kind of, they make up for the defects that individual Erewhonians might have. So an Erewhonian philosophy is to, make humans absolutely the strongest and best, and they're sort of self-selecting for strength and intelligence and so on. Not necessarily for brilliance, because they're not, they don't like individuals who get too far beyond the average. The Erewhonian model and ideal is to fit within the average, to be in the middle of the herd someplace. Not too far behind and not too far ahead. But, a nice, healthy member of the Erewhonian herd, if you will. So machines take they compensate. They compensate for certain types of things that, individuals might not be able to manage. And so in compensating, what does that mean? Those individuals can have children, and those children will inherit those less well-developed or less competitive features. So that's how this society works. So as I said last time, it's the first kind of eugenical society. I mean, the word isn't being used here, and I don't think Butler's had the word in his vocabulary, but it's there, and it's being offered. Of course, this society is being offered as a kind of a satire, so it's not something he's recommending, and he's obviously positioned this professor's treatise, the Book of the Machines. How is that positioned in the book? In Erewhon. It comes from a professor in the colleges of unreason. I didn't have you read all the chapters, but these are colleges that Butler used to satire as a satire against Cambridge, because he spent a lot of time learning Latin. And he couldn't figure out what the Latin was for, what the use was going to be. So in the colleges of unreason, which he was making fun of, the students are taught what they call a, quote, hypothetical language. And the hypothetical language was, it really didn't have any application. You just sort of learned it in order to learn it, but not for any particular application. So he was sort of making fun of the rigorous Latin course that he had to spend, and he spent a lot of his undergraduate years mastering Latin. Some other things too, but a lot of the work that he felt that a lot of the work that he had done as an undergraduate was not really particularly useful for anything, and that it was more or less that he was being expected to go through hoops. So it was a satire, and I think we all have the experience of sometimes being in classes where, in university, where we wonder, what is this for anyway? Exactly how am I going to use this? So, I mean, this is a you might say a universal undergraduate experience of encountering certain types of things that you really wonder, what's the value of this? So he's, as I said, this book is a satire. It's really, in many ways, like Candide. Only, it's another generation, a couple of generations down the line. So it's much more in tune with the 19th century, post-Darwinian world. So this treatise that Chris was just giving us an introduction to is really a treatise written by a professor who is a member of this College of Unreason, and he's sort of giving a history, and he's articulating a theory of why, and this is a treatise that convinced the Erewhonians to go up against machines and to battle against them. And so they became this sort of anti-machine group, and they fought with the supporters of the machines, and the anti-machine group won. And so, and this is a treatise that they that convinced them to go to war against all people who would use machines, and that's why Butler's narrator in this book is jailed, because they find the watch. That's what gets him into trouble with these Erewhonians. Okay, so that's sort of the framework for this piece. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about the background, because this book is in the middle of there's a very large context for some of the things that are being explored in the book. And I sent you out some slides to just say a few things about these. But the existence of machines in Butler's day, in the mid 1800s, machines had proliferated in many different ways. Steam engines were quite common. That's what he's referring to with when he talks about the vapor engine here. And there had been an incredible amount of development of technology around steam power. I mean, steam power was an amazing addition to the possibilities for using and for applying motive force to various types of tasks. And it was steam power was widely used in the Victorian era, and it led to the development of all sorts of things, including the first railways. And as most people know, the railways really began to develop in a big way in the 1800s, both in England and the U.S. But in England, the railway system just exploded. It just developed, and so much so that people began to feel, railways were becoming rather intrusive. Butler himself, the author, was a tremendous user of railways. He traveled all over England and all over Europe on railways. Before that, you had to hire a trap with a horse or something like that. And in the years that Butler lived in New Zealand, a new railway was put in to bring goods from the harbor up to the city of Christchurch, where Butler went to on the South Island of New Zealand. So, and he knew the gentleman who developed the railway system and was one of the first people to ride on one of the first rides of the railway. So there is this sense of the presence of machines becoming rather extensive. And there were other things happening in the time, and he refers to some of this. So I'm just giving you some background on some of it. He talks about the power of machines in the Book of the Machines. In Erewhon, there's a mention to the power of machines for calculating. And Charles Babbage. Anybody here ever hear of Charles Babbage? It's a great Victorian thinker. Somebody who Darwin knew. Darwin knew Charles Babbage. And Babbage was known as he was a genius. He was a wonderful, incredible, fertile mind, just thinking about difference engines, calculating engines, and how to use mechanical power to do numerical calculations. And the whole notion that something like this could be, I don't know if this will, oh, that's not the one I wanted. Okay, well, I sent you an inset. This machine, this difference engine Babbage designed and sort of described how it should be built, but he did not have the resources to build it. So it was always a big question, well, do Babbage's machines really work? And I sent you a clip in this, so if you go back to the slides, of a professor out University of California, Berkeley, who actually built Babbage's machine. And he has an actual a grinder for it, and he actually, at a recent conference, demoed it. And his difference engine works quite beautifully. So he actually built it to scale. Babbage didn't have the resources, and he was one of these people who worked and worked and worked and was always short of money and never had quite enough to carry out all his different schemes. But what he did show is machines, mechanical devices, could be used to process things that we think of as thought. And so again, this notion of the mechanical world and its capabilities among many, many Victorians, 19th century people, had become a very powerful and compelling idea. And people like Darwin and the technical elites were quite familiar with these possibilities. And also these notions of mechanical and the prevalence of the mechanical world and its capabilities were not just elites. Were many, many people in the middle class and in the working classes were in the same environments and understood that these forms of progress were trend-setting and incredibly important, and transforming the way people lived. There were a number of people of Babbage's machines. Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, the poet's daughter. She was one of the first programmers. She was a mathematician, and she wrote programs for Babbage's machines. And she understood the whole notion of programming, the idea that you would create instructions for machines, and then you could feed them into machines, and machines could carry out your instructions. So when we think of these ravings of this professor here, keep in mind that Butler's aware of all this world, and he's not just kind of coming up out of nowhere with these notions, but he's using them also in a kind of it's a sort of satire. He's not being totally serious, but he's also trying to tweak your imagination into thinking about it, and that's what the book's for. It's not to tell you that this is exactly what's going to happen. It's just to make you think about it and think a little more deeply and get beyond your everyday assumptions. And that's the spirit of the book. So he says at the start of chapter 1 of the first chapter on the Book of the Machines, it runs through 3 chapters. He says, there was a time when the earth was, to all appearance, utterly destitute, both of animal and vegetable life, and when, according to the opinion of our best philosophers, it was simply a hot round ball with a crust gradually cooling. Now, if a human being had existed while the earth was in this state, and had been allowed to see it as though it were some other world with which he had no concern, and if at the same time he were entirely ignorant of all physical science, would he not have pronounced it impossible that creatures possessed of anything like consciousness should be evolved from the seeming cinder which he was beholding? Would he not have denied that it contained any potentiality of consciousness? Yet, in the course of time, consciousness came. is it not possible then that there may be even yet new channels dug out for consciousness, though we can detect no signs of them at present? So, what's he saying? I mean, how do we understand this? What does it mean? Jake, what do you think? He says that consciousness, no one would imagine consciousness looking at the earth before, just as it was at the very earliest stage. So,
Well, he's saying that if you look at the very early stages, not only is there no life at all, but if you think of consciousness as like it's an advanced concept really, and you look at the very basic Earth, no life, right? You think, well, maybe some basic life, bacteria, viruses. I mean, the real basic stuff can come out of that maybe, but you think about complex things like self-awareness and cognizance, and I mean, you really don't see that coming. That's what his point is. His point is that these complex things aren't just start popping up all over the place. It just doesn't make sense to see that happening.
okay.
And then I think he also leaves it open for kind of like the unfathomable, beyond. Like if our consciousness came out of this nothing, this, ball of like magma, then in another, however many millennia, what could consciousness evolve to? What's the next level of consciousness?
Yeah, it's pretty impressive that, I mean, from a naturalistic point of view, it's pretty impressive that self-awareness, consciousness, and things of those sorts, that level of activity emerged from a planet that was, at least in the scientific framework of understanding, pretty much a barren planet with nothing on it. So this notion of progress, things, I mean, this notion that change takes place somehow in this endlessly iterative process, that's the key here. And his application of it to machines can make us think back to what is it special about natural selection? What is it about the selection process that delivers something not just the same, but it delivers incremental change? David?
Well, I think it's interesting that like if something doesn't work, if a mutation doesn't work, if a change doesn't work, it just disappears. It isn't allowed to progress at all. So I mean, it keeps that from stagnating, and it always drives something forward, whether it's more complex or more, works better.
So yeah, so when you say drive forward, what you're really referring to is the fact that, there is what we might call a figure of merit, or there's some concept of, something can have more adaptation than something else. So there's an incremental advantage, or there's a differential that favors A or B over A. So there's some differential. And through this iterative process, and then the lack of resources to support everything, as Malthus and Darwin both said, if everything were supported, one single species would totally occupy the earth. So there's not enough. But there's something happening here right at the heart of this iterative process. There is some kind of variation process that takes place, and there's a selecting force. And with that really, really simple dynamic, over large periods of time, you get dramatic changes. But it's always natura non facit saltum. nature does not go through jumps, or does not jump through its development. So this is this notion of consciousness is a product of that. I mean, that's what he's pointing out. This notion of consciousness is a product of that long iteration. So then, our philosopher here says, if this can happen with materials that we would basically consider non-living, why could it not happen with machines? So what about this analogy with machines? Are we back into the realm of Cleanthes with analogies that really don't work? I mean, why does he apply this concept of machines? What is it about machines as opposed to rocks or something?
I mean, like, in terms of natural selection, machines are very, very good at what they do. So they're all, like they can almost evolve by through us, and then they start becoming the best at what they do, to the point where they're even better than humans. So I guess if you take it from that stance, you could say that they could continue evolving once they're better than humans by themselves.
Yeah, machines don't stay the same because we interact with them. Is that correct? I mean, that's how we put it. So we are, in some sense, a selecting force. Now, in what way is this different from natural selection? The human selecting force on machines, making machines better, that primitive steam machine of Watt, as we all know, developed into these incredible railway engines. So how is that similar and different from natural selection?
Well, in the case of machines, the humans are constantly adapting the machines. And I think Darwin said something about like how natural selection never occurs for one animal. Like one animal doesn't evolve to benefit another animal. Like it always evolves to benefit itself, or it always selects for things for itself.
Yes.
I know that was in the instinct chapter, but I think it.
No, you're absolutely correct. The whole notion. He says if you can show me something that doesn't, my whole theory would have to be reconsidered. So
the machines would have to reach some threshold where they could somehow supply the change themselves.
Okay. Other thoughts on this? Well, is there an instance in Darwin's work, in the Origin, where we do have organisms that are changing for other organisms? How about the first chapter? Domestication? I mean, those organisms are changing for the benefit of other organisms, i.e.,
Changing as a result for the other organisms.
yeah, but we're the humans, whether it's conscious selection or unconscious selection, are selecting the individuals, whether it's sheep or chickens or whatever, they're breeding them into domestic species for their own purposes. Yes, Casey?
But the difference between that and machines is that machines aren't their own source of mutation.
Okay.
The humans are both the selector and the source of mutation, whereas in selection of animals, they create random mutations. And then
Yeah, they're working with naturally, provide. Good point. Absolutely. So maybe we have to revise our theories somewhat. And the question is this enough to say these ideas don't work for machines? Elisha, you were going to say something?
Sorry, I was just thinking.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess it's sort of unrelated about the difference between conscious and unconscious selection.
Okay. All right, so yeah, conscious and unconscious selection are in the background here, and certainly probably a lot of machine. But the fact is humans are selecting machines, and I don't know, maybe selecting is not all. I mean, selecting is not all they're doing. Humans are building them too. Yeah. Yeah.
Like the humans are coding the machines, so whereas DNA can vary on its own,
Mm-hmm.
if there's a variance in like computer code, then it's something that we've done and we could probably fix.
Okay.
But we're not necessarily perfect in our programming ways. What if we made an unconscious mistake? That could be.
You remember the Terminator film where they say, what is it? Oh, you haven't seen it, yeah. So there's this moment where there's this sort of network of computers. Skynet has achieved consciousness at 10 something, they say, and boom, suddenly, all this network computing is thinking for itself. And, it's like, whoa. I mean, that's science fiction, but it brings up one important thing, and that is Butler's concept of machine and our more contemporary concept of machine. How do they differ? And how are they similar?
I think Butler's concept of machine, I don't think it's like impossible like in the future. Like given the way we've advanced technology, I mean, I don't think it's impossible to one day imagine machines at that level, at like Butler's level, at the science fiction level.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly is aware of machines being capable of calculating things and thinking, as he says, as the writer in the book says, the mad professor says. When we need to do numbers, we fly to our machines. They're faster, they don't need to rest, and they're more accurate than we are. Of course, we build them and we keep them going and so forth, but nevertheless, they function better at certain levels. So he's aware of this, but most of his mechanical examples here are 19th century mechanical. The computational world that we see coming in just in its early nascent stage with Babbage is going to explode later, but that's going to be after Butler's time. But the concept of a machine as a device for achieving a certain end will become more complicated. The early versions of machine, the steam machines and things of that sort are, powerful, very, very effective at what they do, and prevalent. But in that very evolution of things, machines are going to become vastly more complicated, vastly more capable. This is more what we would associate with a Lamarckian model of the transmission of innovative features. So this whole concept that inheritance actually works and transmits the new level of adaptation of the parent that has been achieved by the parent. That kind of model for that's a model for very rapid change. It's still systematic. These changes all seem to, they're made because they advance functionality and adaptability, if you will, to the task. So, but there's some kind of mechanism here, and the argument in the book of machines here is, so machines evolve through the intermediary of humans. But so what? They still evolve. And so, yeah, it's a different form, but we would want to think of it at least in these terms, because in many ways they're doing the same things as, or they're performing functions, and in many ways these functions are advancing in in ability. So it's rapid, and this notion then of self-replication. You know, do things have to be intentional? Is it necessary for self-consciousness to be part of self-replication? And what does the mad professor argue? Well, he says one thing, what is consciousness? I mean, do we have a definition of consciousness? I mean, we all think we know what consciousness is, but, how do we know? I mean, how do I know you all aren't zombies who've come here to my class? How do you know I'm not just some kind of programmed, something that MIT is testing out, and they have this guy showing up every morning, and he's trying to teach this class, and, there's some person just behind the wall who's manipulating me, I mean, do you know? Do you know what's in somebody else's head? Yeah,
I think our ideas of consciousness is like from earlier in there. It's one of those things that we only really know through our daily experience with it. Mm-hmm. But when we get outside of sort of our comfort zone, things get fuzzy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we sort of know what we know, and as Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." That's a pretty confident statement. But do you think, and therefore are you? I mean, we can't absolutely verify. And even then, even if we can, still, what is the definition of self-consciousness? We struggle with that, especially when we try to. I mean, we don't struggle with it at the level of, say, the novel. Or, I mean, certainly some novels take up the questions of consciousness. Proust was very into questions like this, but where we really begin to struggle with self-consciousness is when we begin to try to think of it in a scientific framework of analyzing it and producing it. I mean, what would it mean to produce consciousness? Well, you have to come up with some definitions. And definitions aren't all that easy. Yeah, David.
I think, like, part of us being unable to deal with, with the concept of consciousness with machines is if you look at, as machines become more and more, I guess, used, like, in the home or whatever. Okay, a specific example, like, imagine, the little robotic vacuums, right? They kind of autonomously go around the house. Like, how many people do you know personify those vacuums? Like, they consider it like a pet. Like, they, it's easy for us to imagine that vacuum has a little goal in mind while it's vacuuming, just because we're so used to a consciousness that it's hard for us to see a machine acting like us or performing a task like us and not expect it to have any type of internal.
This is a big, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Turing would come up with the Turing test. We're going to read Turing a little later. But, Alan Turing thought about these problems. He tried to understand them and tried to come up with ways of thinking about them. Not always successful, but pretty penetrating. But certainly, a lot of the things, do you think we are constantly self-conscious of everything that we do? I mean, we do a tremendous amount of work, labor, which we don't think consciously about as we do it. I mean, so this whole notion of consciousness is, it's not always present in behavior. And so, it sort of glides. And the Book of the Machines argues something to the effect that how can we know a potato doesn't have I mean, a potato in the cellar grows roots and tries to, and we say try, these roots go toward, they're phototropic or whatever they are, and they look for opportunities to implant themselves into some source of sustenance. And as the professor says in the book, he says, isn't this a sort of low form of consciousness? I mean, at what level does consciousness start in the animal world? Are insects conscious? What do you think, Charles?
I think coming up from the very bottom of nature, where like there's always the question of the line between being conscious and not conscious, and so very obviously, like individual cells are not conscious because like it's just one cell and there's no different components that can allow for a cell to be like functioning, but also other parts that can allow it to think. But like obviously there's like, I think consciousness is just a manifestation of natural response that all organisms have to outside stimuli. Like if you stimulate a cell, if you make like one region hot, like things are gonna, like small creatures are gonna move away from it.
So you're saying a protozoan has a kind of a consciousness?
It has an instinct without actually being an instinct. It has a tendency to want to survive. Okay. And I think consciousness is just a manifestation of that. And the line where, like, what we feel is consciousness is hard to nail.
Well, let me just read this quick. But who can say that the vapor engine has not a kind of consciousness? Where does consciousness begin? And where end? Who can draw the line? Who can draw any line? Is not everything interwoven with everything? Well, he's getting... Is not machinery linked with animal life in an infinite variety of ways? So, David, you had your hand up.
Like, there's a few lines. There's like instinct, there's consciousness, and there's like self-awareness. Because I think we can...
Okay.
I think we can agree that like most complex animals are conscious, but like my cat is conscious, but is my cat self-aware? Does it like consider its own existence? I think that's a big line too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, people are studying these questions even as we sit here. He says further on, he says, whether those things which we deem most purely spiritual are anything but disturbances of equilibrium in an infinite series of levers. So we're coming back to, you remember Paley, how beautifully he outlined the body as a mechanism in his effort to show that it had this wonderful design. So in some sense, the design people now, he's coming back to them, because Paley in showing, and other people too, I mean I showed you a lot of different, but in showing the body as this mechanism, and Gray's Anatomy, showing all the parts of the body and beautifully dissecting it out and so forth, we see, body's really an incredible machine. So now we're coming back to, revisiting this from another point of view. Well, this machine is indeed a machine. And why should we think of it as a totally different machine from other machines? Yeah, it has consciousness and intentionality. But, as this thinker here is saying, well, what is consciousness and what is intention? So he says here, the disturbances, those things which we deem most purely spiritual are anything but disturbances of equilibrium in an infinite series of levers, beginning with those that are too small for microscopic detection and going up to the human arm and and the appliances which it makes use of, whether there not be a molecular action of thought. That was an outrageous statement in Butler's day. Is it outrageous today? No cognitive scientists in here, I can see. Brain and cog, go over and ask them. Is thought process somehow mechanical? Are there mechanical, electrical, chemical aspects to it? Is it, I'm sure nobody will give you a definitive answer, but certainly it's the realm of investigation today, right here as we sit. Yeah, Jake.
Well, I mean, the way the nerves work, it is chemicals firing in and out of cells to carry electrical impulse. But I don't know if there can be, because I don't think, again, not a brain cog side guy, but I don't think it's fully understood how those electrical impulses translate into like thought and the more.
I mean, we're not cognitive science. We're reading a novel, but what's interesting is how this piece of speculation brings up questions that, you know, within the framework of evolutionary thinking. I mean, he couldn't have come up with these questions without the evolutionary framework. You understand that, because he's thinking of it as this kind of incremental process that has delivered greater and greater functionality over time, and he's saying, why not for mechanical devices? So he's jumping directly from organic to what we would call the inorganic world. But he's saying, look, you know, these parallels are not outrageous, and we can use one to think about the other. So yeah, we can't come to a definitive answer here on, you know, the question, but we know that the question is not an outrageous question any longer. And the theories and arguments in this, outrageous as they were in their time, well, when he says man is a machinate animal, I mean, yeah, we are merging with machines. We do all sorts of weird things with machines. But certainly machines have extended our functionality in dramatic ways. And so I mean, this limb here, you know, there are people using artificial limbs that are highly functional and have merged with, and, you know, I suppose you could do a thought experiment. I'm going to have to break here soon because I have to leave early today. But a person could do a thought experiment and say, well, how many different artificial things do we have for the body today? We have artificial hands, we have artificial limbs, we're working on artificial hearts, we're working on artificial, I don't know, all kinds of artificial things. So if we did a thought experiment, and we replaced a person, every single part, with something artificial, if we could make it all work together, we might eventually end up with an entirely mechanical entity.
When do they actually die?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, David.
Would the regrowth of organs be considered artificial as well?
Well, that's a good question. Because we can start making our own organic objects. So this is a huge area of research that people are engaged in. And so to what degree is that a human fabrication, i.e. in some sense a mechanical device? Only the mechanics are a biological mechanics that we have become so good at that we're beginning to build the biology, and it's, you know, it's not made up of all these inorganic things. We're building it out of organic tools and organic materials. So where are the lines? So that's what this is dealing with is these lines that we think are so clear from a distance, when we get closer and closer up, aren't so clear. And it's worth thinking about. Okay, well, it's a fun chapter, 3 chapters, mainly because he talks about reproduction. Yes, the machine has to be reproduced outside of the body of the other machine, but there are precedents for things like this in nature. Just because reproduction takes place on the factory line, things are being produced, and they're following certain models, and so and these models are evolving into greater and greater functionality according to our desires. So this is where the design part of the human and the design part of the natural sort of merge.